Hello, everybody, and welcome to That Time When, the show where we talk about everything history. Today we're going to be talking about the history of soda.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show That Time When. I'm your host, Will Newhall, and you're listening to YurtRadio.
After talking about the origin of the smallpox vaccine in the 1918 flu and the invention of the flu vaccine, you may be wondering, well, when are these vaccine episodes going to end? Unless you have a vaccine for your medical episodes, I'm going to get sick of it. Don't worry, this is going to be the last episode. But before I start this show, please get your vaccine if you can, your COVID vaccine if you can. Hampshire is offering the COVID vaccine to people this Sunday, April 25th, 2021. So sign up now and go get your first shot. Let's begin our story. People often talk about anti-vaxxers. Why do people not get the COVID vaccine, even though they have been proven to be safe over and over again? What could possibly convince people to not believe in modern medicine? Well, today, we are going to talk about that. Let's talk about measles, mumps, rubella, and anti-vaxxers. First off, let's talk about measles. What is measles? Measles is an airborne virus that is transmitted when someone sneezes or coughs, much like when you have a cold. It can affect around 90% of the people it comes into contact with. In fact, the measles vaccine is the type of vaccine that we talked about a couple weeks ago, where they use a weaker version of pathogen to teach the body how to react to disease. Symptoms of the virus typically include fever, cough, runny nose, watery eyes, and a rash. Measles was first recognized by a Parisian doctor in the 9th century. No progress was really made towards a treatment until Francis Hone, a Scottish physician, showed that measles is caused by an infectious agent. This is important because this helped improve the case for the germ theory of disease, rather than miasma theory, which they believed in then. If you don't know, the difference between miasma theory and germ theory was the idea that with miasma theory, you contracted disease basically because of bad smells, which obviously isn't true. Now you are contracted disease if there's a pathogen in the air. Despite how prevalent this disease was,
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show That Time When. I'm your host, Will Newhall, and you're listening to YurtRadio.
After talking about the origin of the smallpox vaccine in the 1918 flu and the invention of the flu vaccine, you may be wondering, well, when are these vaccine episodes going to end? Unless you have a vaccine for your medical episodes, I'm going to get sick of it. Don't worry, this is going to be the last episode. But before I start this show, please get your vaccine if you can, your COVID vaccine if you can. Hampshire is offering the COVID vaccine to people this Sunday, April 25th, 2021. So sign up now and go get your first shot. Let's begin our story. People often talk about anti-vaxxers. Why do people not get the COVID vaccine, even though they have been proven to be safe over and over again? What could possibly convince people to not believe in modern medicine? Well, today, we are going to talk about that. Let's talk about measles, mumps, rubella, and anti-vaxxers. First off, let's talk about measles. What is measles? Measles is an airborne virus that is transmitted when someone sneezes or coughs, much like when you have a cold. It can affect around 90% of the people it comes into contact with. In fact, the measles vaccine is the type of vaccine that we talked about a couple weeks ago, where they use a weaker version of pathogen to teach the body how to react to disease. Symptoms of the virus typically include fever, cough, runny nose, watery eyes, and a rash. Measles was first recognized by a Parisian doctor in the 9th century. No progress was really made towards a treatment until Francis Hone, a Scottish physician, showed that measles is caused by an infectious agent. This is important because this helped improve the case for the germ theory of disease, rather than miasma theory, which they believed in then. If you don't know, the difference between miasma theory and germ theory was the idea that with miasma theory, you contracted disease basically because of bad smells, which obviously isn't true. Now you are contracted disease if there's, a pathogen in the air. Despite how prevalent this disease was, research remained fairly limited, and it wasn't until 1912 when data started being collected on it, and measles became a nationally notifiable disease in the U.S. This required U.S. healthcare providers and laboratories to report all diagnoses of measles. After only a few years, it turned out that an average of 6,000 measles-related deaths were reported each year. And that's only deaths in at-risk groups. Can you imagine how many people got sick and nearly died? By 1950, 3 to 4 million people in the U.S. were infected with measles each year, some of whom suffered a swelling of the brain that later killed them. In 1954, the tide finally began to turn. Over 1,000 years, and the battle had only begun to turn to our side. See, measles first appeared way back when, with that Parisian doctor that I mentioned. But these doctors helped change things. John F. Enders and Dr. Thomas C. Peebles, yes, Peebles is his name, collected blood samples from patients in Boston to try and isolate the measles virus and create a successful measles vaccine. After many trials and errors, they finally succeeded with the blood of David Edmonston, a 13-year-old boy. Finally, in 1963, Enders and his colleagues successfully turned the Edmonston B strain, named after the boy from whom they got the virus, into a vaccine that began to be distributed to the public. This particular vaccine has been the only one used in the U.S. since 1968 and is the vaccine that is combined with mumps and rubella to create the now infamous MMR vaccine, which we're going to discuss a little bit later. By 2000, just over 20 years ago, measles was considered eliminated. However, that was not to continue, unfortunately. A couple of years ago, I'm sad to report, there was another measles outbreak. This is largely due to anti-vaccine sentiment relating to the MMR vaccine. If you're wondering why we know this, it's because the source of the virus was people who were not vaccinated against it. 2019 actually had the greatest number of cases since 1992. So please get your vaccines. The next pathogen on the list is mumps. Mumps, like measles, is caused by a virus and can indeed be vaccinated against. Its symptoms include respiratory problems and notably swelling of the salivary glands below the ear. Mumps is also transmitted by respiratory droplets that can become airborne when someone coughs, sneezes, or talks. Mumps has not been successfully eliminated, although cases have gone down significantly thanks to the introduction of a mumps vaccine in 1967. This vaccine was a type called a live attenuated mumps vaccine, which, if you've listened to the past podcasts, you'll know that this is a particular type of vaccine where a weakened version of the virus is put into the body and then easily beaten by the person's immune system, which then teaches the immune system how to fight off future infections. We believe that the first case of mumps was recorded almost 2,500 years ago by Hippocrates, an ancient Greek doctor, though it most likely existed long before that. Hippocrates' knowledge and writing in most subjects is quite antiquated, and the vast majority of it doesn't work compared to modern medicine. But, in this case, physicians still refer to this part on mumps today because of how detailed it was about an outbreak on the Greek island of Thasos. This Hippocratic writer observed an outbreak of measles, and his notes have been quite useful to us since then. I say his, but if you know anything about Hippocratic writers, you know that Hippocrates was a real person, but for quite a few centuries he was also essentially a pen name among doctors for a while. So this could be the actual Hippocrates, but it's more likely to be a different writer. Although actually, now that I think about it, given the time, it could actually be the original Hippocrates. Anyway, although he could do nothing about it, this writer still took notes, and their notes have paid off. See? Who says you can't learn anything from history class? For a long time, we really didn't know, nor could we do anything about mumps, simply because we didn't have the technology or knowledge for successful treatment. It wasn't until 1934 when scientists Claude D. Johnson and Ernest W. Goodpasture finally discovered the viral etiology, aka the cause of mumps. They discovered this because they noticed that monkeys that had been infected with a particular virus typically developed the symptoms of mumps. From this, they concluded that this virus was what caused mumps. It took another 11 years before they could successfully isolate the mumps virus, but soon after, in 1948, an inactivated vaccine was developed. But this wasn't the end of the story. While this vaccine was revolutionary and saved many lives from the deadly mumps virus, it was eventually discontinued in the 1970s when a more effective version that I already mentioned came around. On the 3rd of March 1967, the FDA licensed the mumps vaccine called, get this, Mumps Vax. Maurice Hilleman created, I think that's how his name is pronounced, Maurice Hilleman, created the vaccine by taking a sample from his own 5-year-old daughter who had been infected and used it as the basis for his new vaccine. What he created from this was the live attenuated vaccine that we now use today. In fact, a lot of the vaccines he created were still used today, are still used today. I think it's 8 out of the 14 vaccines he made we still use today. For example, he created the hepatitis B vaccine, which was used in 1981, and by 2003 it was used in 150 countries. He produced a flu vaccine that saved millions of multiple lives during the 1957 flu pandemic and the 1968 flu pandemic. So both of these flu pandemics. Why haven't you heard of these pandemics, you ask? Well, because A, they weren't as big as COVID-19 or 1918, and B, were prevented quickly thanks to the Hilleman vaccine and Hilleman's colleagues. Now for the last disease we're going to discuss today, rubella. Rubella is a virus from the genus known as rubavirus. Go figure. Rubella is spread by airborne respiratory droplets. If you've been paying attention, then you probably already guessed that. Its signature symptom is a rash of pink or light red spots on the face that then spread downwards. Much like with polio, illness from rubella is usually pretty mild, but complications occur later in life in adults with things like arthritis, encephalitis, and neuritis. A pregnant woman can also give it to a fetus, which can result in spontaneous abortion or premature birth. But if by some miracle the fetus does survive, the child may suffer from a wide range of birth defects, including deafness, eye defects, cardiac defects, bone lesions, and other abnormalities. So basically, get vaccinated, people. Rubella was initially believed to be a variant of measles or scarlet fever. It was first described as its own distinct disease in 1814, when George Maton, a German physician, mentioned in a German medical literature where it got the moniker German measles. Maton realized that this illness, characterized by rash, adenopathy, and little to no fever, was actually a different disease from measles. But not much could be done about it since they didn't really have treatments of any sort at the time. In 1866, Henry Vial, I think that's how his name is pronounced, named the disease rubella. We didn't really know a whole lot about rubella, and we didn't have any treatments. In fact, no one really cared about it too much, since it only seemed to affect young kids, and the only patients who died were often older, and seemed to die of complications that weren't directly related to it. It wasn't until 1942 when an Australian ophthalmologist, Norman Gregg, yes, that was his real name, Gregg, noticed that first trimester mothers who contracted rubella caused the serious birth defects that I listed above. Research then quickly began. The war drums began to beat quicker and quicker as scientists began to work, so to speak. We already had that theory that rubella was a virus thanks to Alfred F. Hesse's work with monkeys back in 1914. By 1962, we managed to successfully isolate the rubella virus. In fact, it was done simultaneously by 2 independent groups. But medicine didn't have the time to be amused by that similarity. This new information quickly turned into a rubella vaccine, which was licensed in 1969. A better version would come around in 1979, and is the one that we use today. So, the year is 1969. We now have measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines. But Maurice Hilleman, remember that guy, wondered if he could combine them. It might make it easier to vaccinate kids if you had to only administer one shot rather than 3. Besides, kids, understandably, might be a little freaked out by needles. I still am. Hilleman successfully put this vaccine together in 1971, and it was later updated in 1989 with better versions of certain vaccines in the cocktail. Now, this is all well and good, and people were getting vaccinated, and these viruses were being slowly eradicated. In fact, some later get declared eradicated. Woohoo! People are getting vaccinated. Modern medicine for the win, right? But there was a storm cloud looming. Hold on to your seat, because this story is about to get really wild. Andrew Wakefield, a British medical researcher, and 12 colleagues published a paper in the well-respected British medical magazine The Lancet, which suggested that the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella, that was invented by Hilleman, caused behavioral regression and pervasive development disorder in children. This spread through the media like wildfire, and the number of people getting the vaccine began to plummet. This story sounds familiar, right? Yeah, well, keep listening. Now, before you go off on your little soapbox and begin to talk about how vaccines cause autism, you should know that there were issues. You should know that there were issues with this paper, some pretty serious ethical issues. At the bare minimum, it was that the entire design was flawed. In the study, there were only 12 children involved. It was completed completely uncontrolled, and the conclusion that vaccines cause developmental disorders was complete and total speculation, and really had no basis in any of the evidence. And this is only the very bare minimum of the unethical things that Jenner did a good thing. Wakefield did a bad thing. This is only the bare minimum of the bad things Wakefield did. Scientists, understandably, were quite skeptical of this new study, and normally, if it hadn't gotten such media attention so quickly, it probably wouldn't have really been noticed, simply because it wasn't as big as the media made it sound. It probably would have been changed within the next year still, probably pretty quickly, but it really only had 12 subjects after all, and it was pretty speculative, so people probably wouldn't have taken it very seriously. But they would have eventually gotten around to completely refuting it in a year or so. But sadly, that wasn't to be the case. The TV and radio and other forms of media got a hold of this study and began to spread this misinformation globally. And it began to really take hold in parents who were already alarmed by vaccines. I should pause here and say that these parents' fear is kind of understandable. I mean, think about it. Let's put you in their shoes. Your child is regularly being injected with something that you don't know a whole lot about, which scares you, but your doctor reassures you that it's safe. So, you listen to your doctor. So hearing that this vaccine might cause issues just feeds into that mistrust that you already have and gives you a reason to not want to get you or your kid vaccinated. And that's essentially what happened. It, like a seed, it kind of stuck into these people's minds and quickly grew to be not just the MMR vaccine, but all vaccines. This twisted rationale took hold of concerned parents' minds, and people began to not get the MMR vaccine. It quickly began to plummet. From 1998 on, the line kind of plummets. Even worse, the tiny anti-vax voice I talked about over the last couple of weeks that originally appeared with Edward Jenner and the smallpox vaccine, yeah, that movement got much, much louder and more people joined them. So that obviously is not good. After epidemiological studies showed that this fear of vaccines and autism was completely false, 10 of the 12 co-authors of Edward Jenner, why do I keep confusing them? Edward Jenner created the smallpox vaccine, Andrew Wakefield, screwed up royally. The 12 co-authors of the Andrew Wakefield paper retracted from it, saying that, quote, no link was established between the MMR vaccine and autism. Soon after this announcement, it was discovered that, surprise, surprise, Wakefield and his co-authors had actually been funded by lawyers who were engaged in lawsuits against vaccine companies. So to sum it up, it turned out that Wakefield was being paid under the table to lie about vaccines in order to help attorneys sue vaccine companies. And that's not even the craziest part. The craziest part, you wonder? That's not it? Will, how could it get worse? Well, let me tell you. In 2010, Wakefield and his colleagues were held guilty of ethical violation and scientific misrepresentation. Apparently, they had experimented on children without getting the right ethical clearances. What are these ethical clearances, you may ask? Well, for one, they collected their pseudo-data from what the children's parents observed and what those parents believed were the issue. Hint, they thought it began with a V for vaccine. Wakefield also claimed that his group of 12 kids were randomized, when in fact some had been selected by Wakefield and others had been recruited by the lawyers who hired Wakefield. Wakefield also subjected these kids to very difficult and invasive tests, like a colonoscopy, which literally none of them needed. He also had a serious conflict of interest. He was, at the same time of doing this, trying to obtain or patent his own version of the measles vaccine, which he would sell at a huge profit as a supposedly safe alternative to the MMR vaccine. In fact, one of the parents involved in the study was the co-founder of the business that Wakefield wanted to use to sell his new measles vaccine. Oh yeah, and on top of that giant mess, Wakefield also paid kids at his own son's birthday party £5 so that he could draw their blood. Imagine this. Here, kid, I'll give you £5 if you let me stab you with a needle and suck your blood out. That's basically what Wakefield did. Even with all of this known, it still took The Lancet until 2010, as recently as 2010, to fully remove and denounce Wakefield's article. So what about these anti-vaxxers? What happened to them? Well, unfortunately, they still exist in a loud group today. I will say they're in the minority. Most people will get a vaccine. But they do still, unfortunately, exist, and they are, unfortunately, a very loud minority. In fact, the ones I've run into, or the most notable of these ones, were pretty aggressive, who, when asked, will tell you about how all vaccines cause autism and you should never get a vaccine because it's poison. I'm just going to tell you outright, you shouldn't argue with these people. Just ignore them, and please go get your COVID vaccine or any other vaccine that you need. Vaccines are important. So we've talked about the anti-vaccine movement after Jenner. Let's continue that story. After Jenner published his research, there quickly came backlash. This was for a few reasons. For one thing, there was no formal method, so some doctors would try some procedures that would be very easily screwed up, and they'd end up transmitting more than cowpox. These would include diseases such as syphilis. This was because these people would try the person-to-person method that was similar to Jenner's method, but not quite the same. In part because Jenner was more careful with whom he got his specimen from. For these people, they would get their sample from another person who had cowpox, but also might have had another disease like the aforementioned syphilis. Other concerns were religious. Some people believed that these vaccines went against God's will, because, according to these people, God wanted you to die a horrible and painful death. Another was the idea that, if you got the cowpox vaccine, you were being polluted with unnatural animal matter. And yet another excuse, unfortunately, was financial. Some doctors didn't want to get rid of other forms of treatment like variolation, and others would try to charge insane amounts for the smallpox vaccine, leaving people with no money whatsoever, simply because it was more profitable. Some quacks would even charge insane amounts of money and not actually give you the vaccine. And another issue was simply pride. Who was this random country doctor to tell everyone else about this new vaccine? One political cartoon even appeared to show a cow head growing out of people's bodies in a newspaper. And others still were eerily similar, other anti-vax sentiments still were similar to anti-vaxxers now, except that they believed that the smallpox vaccine caused syphilis instead of autism. Their logic, much like the logic of anti-vaxxers now, was of course flawed. So, all of that said, what can we learn from this? Well, for one thing, we can learn that despite the concerns of some people, vaccines do actually work and have successfully eradicated diseases like smallpox. We can also learn that vaccines are very helpful in defeating disease. But in order to really defeat them, people must get these vaccines. Only then can we begin to defeat diseases like COVID. With regards to what we've learned about anti-vaxxers today, one could argue that we learned sympathy. We learned that these people aren't really stupid as much as they are scared and successfully conned by an unethical scientist. Freaking Wakefield. Perhaps if we lead by example and get the vaccine, we can convince more people to get this vaccine. So please, whatever you do, please get vaccinated. The more people that can get vaccinated, the better, and the more quickly we can get rid of COVID. Vaccines are available for everyone on campus this Sunday, April 25th, 2021. Please go do it. Go get your shot, and I hope to hear from all of you next week, vaccinated, and yeah, see you then. Bye-bye.
This has been That Time When. Keep doing kooky things so that in 100 years, people like me can talk about them. Bye for now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to That Time When, the show where we talk about everything history.